Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are finally going to see the reunion of Joseph and Benjamin. And I do think it is a reunion. It's hard to say how old Benjamin is, but I do believe that he was just really, really young when Joseph, quote unquote, disappeared. But obviously, he was sold into slavery into Egypt. So, with that being said, this is a reunion, but still, um, Joseph is probably not going to recognize him at first, but he will assume it's Benjamin. So, go back to Genesis chapter 43, verse 16. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, "Bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon." The man did as Joseph told him and brought the men to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, "It's because of the money which was placed in our sacks the first time that we are brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us to make us servants and seize our donkeys." And this is a very valid idea that the brothers have. Obviously, we are given a little bit of a behind the scenes look that this is actually just this grand feast that Joseph is putting together, but in the eyes of the brothers, are we about to go and die? Like this is a very serious moment, and they think they're walking into just something that's not going to end well for them, let's say. But that's not the case. Verse 19. So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the door of the house and said, "O my lord, we came down the first time to buy food. And when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it again with us. And we have brought other money down with us to buy food. We do not we do not know who put our money in our sacks." So they tell him exactly what happened. And you may be thinking, okay, when the brothers found that out at this lodging place in between Egypt and Canaan, why didn't they go back? Well, that's easy for us to say because we would typically just drive there. That's not the case here. If they had any sort of transportation, camels, donkeys, that's it. Most of it would be by foot. And you have to remember too, they have families back at home in Canaan that are expecting and hoping for this grain to make bread and to make other things. So they really can't go back to talk about the money that was in the bag. So they went on. So it's not like they were literally trying to steal and they didn't care, so they didn't go back. No, they were in a really rough spot, so they didn't go back. But they brought it back, though. So again, you're seeing the character of the brothers change for the better. It doesn't mean, of course, it doesn't mean that what they did before was wrong, but you're seeing that change in the brothers' character. That they tell this doorman exactly what happened. And it's interesting how he replies. Verse 23. He replied, "Peace to you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your fathers put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. And um, it's interesting and it's really, really cool to see that the doorman is attributing the the basically the whole story of the brothers coming to Egypt to the God of Joseph. And he doesn't say my God, sadly, right? He does say your God and the God of your father. So that is sad. But it's interesting that he sees the work of Yahweh throughout all of this. And you would think would have been really hard for him, the doorman, to let slip, and the God and the and the God of my Lord, which is Joseph. and the God of him too. It must have crossed his mind, but he didn't let it slip. So thankfully, the story can continue on with what we know. But it must have crossed his mind. Oh, and it's that guy's God too, which is your brother, by the way. It would have been really, really interesting to see if that even crossed his mind, but he didn't let it slip. But Simeon is brought out of either house arrest or prison and brought to them. Verse 24. And when the man had brought the men into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder or food, they prepped the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. So it's interesting, I think, with Simeon too. It's there is this idea that years have passed since that Simeon is being detained. Possibly, but I don't see that as. I actually see it as a lot shorter than you might think. Yes, they are given a lot of grain. We don't know the size of the bag, but they are given a lot of grain. And each brother is given grain. So if you take so there's 10 brothers at this point. Simeon is left in Egypt, and then Joseph is obviously in Egypt. So there's 10 bags that are sent. And it could be that Joseph might have sent an 11th bag on behalf of Simeon. But let's say there's at least 10. So those 10 will be spread out between the families of Simeon and the other brothers, and then of course Jacob as well. So even though it may seem like it may take a while for them to come back to Egypt, I don't necessarily see that anywhere. There's nothing that mentions how long it took, but my guess is it probably didn't take as long as you expect for them to go through that grain for them and their families. Because as we could tell with the family of Jacob, this family is not small. This family is pretty big. So that's my guess. Simeon probably wasn't in Egypt in house arrest or prison as long as we might think. Verse 26. When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them, and bowed down to him to the ground. And I think in this moment it would be really interesting. It'd be very hard for Joseph to not be overjoyed by these presents because they would remind him of home. Because they are coming from Canaan, and so the myrrh and the gum and the almonds. I mean, these things. Yes, they probably could have been in Egypt too, but I think they would have brought back memories of home for Joseph. And so it must have been really hard for him to see those gifts, to smell them, and to taste them, and not to go, oh, this reminds me of home. And then the brothers would be like, what? So I think that would have been really, really difficult for him. But it's a beautiful moment for Joseph too, which again gets him closer to revealing who he is. Verse 27. And Joseph asked or inquired about their welfare and said, "Is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive?" They said, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. And you maybe think, okay, didn't he just ask this before? Yes, but some time has passed. And in this day and age, who knows? And so it's a valid question. And of course, it shows that Joseph is very much still cares and loves his father and misses him dearly. But then you see at the end there, and they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. This is the second time that the brothers have bowed down to Joseph. Now, it's the first time that Benjamin has. So, yes, the fulfilling of the first dream, that is very much the case. But this could be the transition from the first dream to the second dream with the moon and the sun. Not that Benjamin is one of those, but he's another one of the stars, another one of the brothers. Me personally, I think that it's actually possible that Benjamin is, in a sense, the moon, and that he is, again, the connection to Rachel, who would be the moon. Yet, so at this point, Rachel has died. So she cannot bow down to Joseph. And so who can? Benjamin, the last, and obviously the only other son of Rachel, because Joseph is not bowing down to himself here. And so I think that this is actually the moon bowing down, even though it doesn't make sense on the surface that he would be the moon. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it actually shows that Benjamin, I think, is in place of the moon. And so it's the start of the fulfilling of the second dream. And we'll see that more when Jacob finally comes to Egypt. And I think that's really, really interesting. Verse 29, and he lifted up his eyes, Joseph, and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. So, it's interesting because I think, again, with the moon idea, this backs it up. Immediately after, he sees Benjamin, and it says his mother's son. And so I think that is the connection between Benjamin being the moon from the second dream that he had while he was still a teenager in Canaan, Joseph meaning. But he lavishes upon him, God be gracious to you, and he calls him his son. Verse 30, though, it shows you the toil that this is taking on Joseph's emotions. Verse 30, Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, Serve the food. So, obviously, this makes sense. Not that he isn't stirred with compassion to the other brothers, because I think once we get to the revelation of who Joseph is, he will show that he has forgiven his brothers. And so it's not that. I think it's mainly because, obviously, when this all occurred, when Joseph was sold into slavery, Benjamin would have been extremely, extremely young. He had nothing to do with it, basically. And so, and of course, the connection to his mom, to his mother. And so I think that's why you see so much compassion and the emotional turmoil here in verses 30 and 31. It does make you wonder, wouldn't the brothers kind of see this as interesting or suspicious? Maybe. But it could be too that he did so in like a speed walk to get ready for the lunch or the dinner or whatever time it was. It could be that. So it may not be like he was actually crying and running out. Oh, like it's not like that. Like I don't think he did that. I think he probably just sped walk out of there and then cried somewhere by himself, just overcome with the emotion that he's feeling. Verse 32, they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And yet, Joseph is a Hebrew. But I think at this point, it's almost like Pharaoh adopts. He adopts Joseph to being an Egyptian. Now, is it possible that he doesn't know that Joseph is a Hebrew, being Pharaoh? Pharaoh doesn't know that about Joseph, maybe, but I think it's probably come up. But I think, in a way, Pharaoh has adopted Joseph as a son of Egypt, and so I think that's really quite interesting, but it kind of does make you chuckle. Like they're saying, okay, Egyptians can't eat with Hebrews, and yet Joseph is a Hebrew, but Joseph does eat. He is served by him to himself. And they sat, verse 33, and they sat before him the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. So there's a couple points of amazement here that we see in verses 33 and 34. They're obviously amazed by the generosity to Benjamin, especially with him being the youngest of the 12, not just of the 11 that are known to be alive, but the youngest of all the brothers, and yet he has the biggest portion. Now, this could be seen as a dig by Joseph against the other brothers, but I think it is almost a hint by Joseph that there's something going on here. It's not just a coincidence that I'm treating Benjamin this well. And then, too, the second amazement is that they were all lined up from the firstborn to the youngest. And yet, that must click in their mind. Wait, are we lined up from oldest to youngest? Who would know that? How would somebody know that? Now, granted, it's possible they might have told him, here's the oldest brother, and here's the youngest brother, and here's them all in between, but we don't see that. So, most likely, it is Joseph just knowing, of course, who is who. And again, it's a hint. I think it's a hint at who Joseph really, really is. And so, with that, we will see how this then plays into we will see how this plays into Joseph's revelation of who he is. So, with that being said, though, he is going to test them one final time in Genesis 44, and we will look at that next week. Thanks.